We all like the idea of powering our world with clean, renewable energy like wind. It promises sustainability, energy independence. Sounds great.
It does.
But have you ever stopped to think about what happens when the wind, well, sort of takes a year off?
Hmm.
Not just a day or a season, but maybe a whole year or even a couple of years with lower wind than usual. It's a tricky problem, isn't it? Kind of lurking under the surface.
It absolutely is. And while, a lot of focus goes on the daily ups and downs or even seasonal shifts,
Yeah.
this deep dive is looking at something called interannual variability.
Interannual, so year to year.
Exactly. Year to year. The fact that resources like wind can really fluctuate quite a bit over those longer timescales, some years just aren't as windy.
Right.
And if your whole system is banking heavily on wind, well, that makes keeping a steady energy supply a real challenge.
Okay, so it's not just averaging out the wind over time. It's making sure there's enough, even in those like lean wind years, almost like an energy rainy day fund.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So what specifically are we digging into today? What's the focus?
Today, we're exploring the findings of a specific study called Exploring the Demand for Interannual Storage for Balancing Wind Energy Variability in 100% Renewable Energy Systems.
Okay.
And this research, it zooms in on the UK and the Republic of Ireland. They've got great wind resources, ambitious green goals.
All right.
And the study asks, how can they guarantee a secure energy supply even when they hit those multi-year patches of lower wind?
Perfect. And just to be clear for everyone listening, the insights we're discussing, they're coming primarily from this specific piece of research.
That's correct.
Okay, let's get right to the heart of it then. Why is this year-to-year wind variability such a critical problem? Why does it need this level of attention?
Well, technologies for storing energy seasonally,
Mm-hmm.
for weeks or months, they're definitely advancing. People are working on that.
Yeah.
But this issue of whole years having lower wind output, it hasn't really had the same research focus. It's a bit of a gap. And as this study points out, wind power, and actually hydropower too, they're particularly prone to this year-to-year variation.
Mm.
Interestingly, offshore wind tends to be a bit more stable than onshore wind,
Uh-huh.
but it's still variable.
Okay, still fluctuates. What about solar?
Solar PV generally shows less of this interannual fluctuations, more consistent year on year compared to wind or hydro.
That kind of makes sense intuitively. You can imagine wind patterns over the sea might be a bit more steady than over land with terrain and stuff.
Yeah, that plays a role.
And given that the UK and Ireland are really pushing for wind power in their strategies, this research feels particularly relevant for them, doesn't it?
Absolutely critical. Their government plans rely on a big share of wind in the future energy mix.
So how variable are we actually talking? Did the study quantify it?
They did. They looked at 33 years of historical wind data for Great Britain from 1980 up to 2012. And the findings are quite stark, really.
Okay.
The best year for wind yield had what's called a capacity factor of 0.38, the lowest year, just 0.255.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is. The average over that whole period was 0.324, and they use that as a reference point, like a typical year in some models.
So 0.38 down to 0.255.
Yeah, if you compare the worst year to that average reference year, it's roughly a 21% drop.
21%. So if you're planning your energy system based on an average year, you could realistically find yourself almost a quarter short on wind power in a bad year.
Precisely. That's a massive shortfall to suddenly have to make up somehow.
Okay, that 21% swing really hits home. Now, I know wind turbines today are way more efficient than the ones back in the 80s or 90s. Does that help with this variability problem?
That's a really important point. Modern turbines definitely achieve much higher performance, more full load hours.
Right.
This study estimates something like 4,467 full load hours in an average year for the British Isles using current tech. That works out to a capacity factor around 0.51.
Okay, 0.51 is much better than the historical 0.324 average.
Oh, definitely. It's a huge improvement in efficiency.
Hmm.
But, and this is the key thing, even with these better turbines, the underlying variability in the wind resource itself, that still exists. The wind still blows more some years than others.
Got it. So higher average output, but the year-to-year percentage swings might still be there. We still need to bridge that gap between the windy years and the less windy ones.
Exactly. How do we smooth out those multi-year bumps?
Which leads us nicely to the solutions the study explored, this idea of interannual storage, or IAS. What exactly is that?
Interannual storage, IAS. Just like it sounds, it's about storing surplus energy made when renewables are abundant, like in high wind years, and then saving it, holding onto it to use during those leaner years that follow.
Ah, okay. Long-term energy saving.
Essentially, yes. And this study specifically looked at two main ways to do this, using e-hydrogen or using e-methane.
Okay, let's break those down. E-hydrogen first. That involves using extra wind power for electrolysis, right? Making hydrogen from water.
That's the one. In those years with lots of wind, you take the surplus electricity, feed it into electrolyzers.
Mm-hmm.
These split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then you store the hydrogen gas.
Store it for potentially years.
That's the idea behind IAS, yes,
Hmm.
for use in a low wind year down the line.
Okay. And e-methane, how's that different?
So e-methane actually starts the same way you make hydrogen using electrolysis from excess renewables.
Right.
But then you add a couple more steps. You need to capture carbon dioxide, CO2, from the air. There's a technology for that called direct air capture, or DAC.
Okay, grab CO2 from the atmosphere.
Yep. And then you react that captured CO2 with your green hydrogen in a process called methanation. And what you get is synthetic methane, e-methane, CH4.
Which is basically synthetic natural gas.
Pretty much. And the advantage there is we already know how to store and transport methane quite well, so you store this e-methane instead of hydrogen.
Interesting. So both start with hydrogen from wind, but e-methane adds DS and methanation. Now, how did the researchers figure out how much storage we actually need for this interannual balancing?
They used a pretty sophisticated tool, the LUT Energy System Transition Model, or LUT-ESTM. It simulates the entire energy system.
Okay.
They model a 100% renewable energy system for the British Isles, looking out to the year 2050.
And initially, this model just used an average wind year.
Exactly. Their baseline model didn't include this year-to-year variability. It used data from 2005 as a kind of representative average wind year.
But that doesn't capture the 21% swings we talked about.
No. So the next step, the core of this study, was to feed in those 33 years of actual historical wind data.
Okay. Introduce the real-world fluctuations.
Precisely. To estimate what kind of balancing would be needed, specifically looking from 2040 onwards, they figured IAS becomes really crucial once renewables hit about 71% of the total primary energy demand.
Right. And did they consider different levels of risk? Like, what if you get 2 bad wind years in a row?
They did. They looked at 3 security levels: low, medium, and high. These basically reflect how well this system could cope with not just one low wind year, but potentially several consecutive ones.
That makes sense. You'd want to plan for a worst-case sequence, potentially.
For true security, yes.
And when this stored gas, hydrogen, or methane is actually needed in a low wind year, how did the model assume it would be used?
Good question. They considered 2 main pathways. One is power to gas to power, PTGTP. That's taking the stored gas and using it to generate electricity again, maybe in turbines or engines.
Okay, back to electricity.
But the study primarily focused on what they call power to gas to feedstock, or PTGTF.
Feedstock.
Yeah, using the stored hydrogen or methane directly, maybe as fuel for heavy transport, or for high-temperature heat in industry, or even as a chemical building block to make other e-fuels or materials.
Ah, so bypassing the step of making electricity again.
Exactly. And that PTGTF route tends to be more energy efficient overall because you avoid the conversion losses of going back to power.
I see. Okay, so they did all this complex modeling. What were the big findings? How much storage capacity are we talking about?
The numbers are, well, they're huge, really substantial.
Lay it on us.
Okay, so by 2050, for both e-hydrogen and e-methane routes, this study estimates you'd need interannual storage capacity of more than 300 terawatt hours, thermal, lower heating value, that's TOAA, LHV, just for the low security case.
300 TWH.
And for higher security.
For the high security case needing to ride out potentially worse or longer low wind periods, that figure jumps to over 500 TBF LHV.
500 terawatt hours. How does that compare to, say, the seasonal storage needs in their baseline model without this IAS?
Great comparison point. In that reference scenario without IAS, the seasonal hydrogen storage needed was only about 6 TIS LHV, and seasonal methane storage was just 1.2 TIS LHV.
Wow. So 6 TWA versus potentially 500 TWA.
Exactly. We're talking about storage capacities potentially almost 100 times larger to handle the interannual problem compared to just the seasonal one. It's a completely different scale. Absolutely massive. That really puts the challenge into perspective.
Okay, so if you build all this storage, how does that affect the rest of the energy system? Like, how much wind power generation do you need?
Well, logically, if you need to store energy for lean years, you need to generate more in the good years,
Yeah.
right? And the study found exactly that. Both the E-hydrogen and E-methane IAS scenarios led to a significant increase in the total annual wind electricity generation needed.
How much more?
By 2050, they projected needing around 885 to 891 terawatt hours of wind power annually with IAS, compared to about 783 TW in the reference scenario without IAS.
So roughly an extra 100 TW of wind generation per year just to charge up the interannual storage over time.
That's the idea. You need that extra capacity during the high-yield years to produce enough hydrogen or methane to fill those huge storage caverns for the future.
And more wind power feeding into storage means a lot more electrolyzers to make the hydrogen in the first place. Precisely. The required electrolyzer capacity basically doubles. It goes from about 66 gigawatts electrical GWEL in the reference case up to around 134 to 138 GWEL in the IES scenarios. A huge jump.
Okay. And for the e-methane route, you also need the extra kit for that, right? The DOC and methanation?
Yes. The e-methane scenario requires building up substantial methanation capacity, about 1.8 gigawatts of methane output, GWCH4, and a really large scale-up of direct air capture for the CO2, hitting 66.5 million tons of CO2 per year.
Huge industrial processes involved there.
Definitely. And interestingly, even in the e-methane scenario, because some applications might still specifically need pure hydrogen as a feedstock,
Right.
the model found you still need some capacity for steam methane reforming SMRs to convert some of that stored e-methane back into hydrogen, around 17.4 gigawatts of hydrogen capacity, GWH2 from SMR.
So it's a complex, interconnected system with lots of moving parts needed to make IAS work.
Very much so.
What about the elephant in the room? The cost. How do these massive storage solutions affect the overall cost of the energy system, according to the study?
Unsurprisingly, adding this huge layer of interannual storage significantly increases the total annual system costs.
Okay. By how much?
For the medium security level, the e-hydrogen IAS pathway came out about 19% more expensive annually compared to the reference case without IAS.
19% higher. And e-methane.
The e-methane route, while still more expensive than doing nothing for IAS, had a smaller cost increase, about 7% higher annually for that medium security level.
Okay, 7% versus 19%. That's a pretty substantial difference between the two storage options. What's driving that? Why is the hydrogen route so much pricier in this analysis?
The study points very clearly to one main factor: the cost of actually storing the hydrogen underground.
Ah, the storage technology itself.
Exactly. The estimated costs for large-scale geological storage of hydrogen are significantly higher than for storing methane. And apparently, this high storage cost for hydrogen outweighs the extra cost you have in the e-methane pathway, building the deog plants and the methanation units.
So making e-methane is more complex, but storing it is cheaper than storing the equivalent amount of energy as hydrogen.
That's what this study's cost assumptions suggest, yes. When they looked at the total capital investment, the CapEx, needed by 2050,
Yeah.
the e-hydrogen IAS scenarios range from about 197 to 227 billion euros, depending on the security level. The e-methane ones were lower, between 175 and 180 billion euros, compared to the reference case with no IAS, which was projected at 125 billion euros capex.
Okay, so a big investment needed either way for IES, but e-methane looks considerably cheaper overall based on these findings. What does that mean for the price of energy for, us, the end users?
That's looked at through metrics like the levelized cost of electricity, LCOE. The study found the impact on LCOE was actually relatively small for both IAS options.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Well, LCOE just looks at electricity generation cost. But this storage is also supporting non-electric energy uses, like heat and transport fuels, via the PDGTF pathway.
Right.
So a broader metric they use is the levelized cost of final energy and non-energy use, LCOFE. And that showed a more noticeable increase, especially for the e-hydrogen option.
Okay, so the overall energy cost, considering heat and fuels too, does go up more with IAS, particularly the hydrogen route.
Correct. The LCOED increase reflects the higher total system cost needed to provide that year-round energy security.
Okay, so the big takeaway seems to be e-methane looks like a more cost-effective way to achieve this vital interannual storage for the UK and Ireland, mainly because storing vast amounts of hydrogen underground is just really, really expensive.
That's the main conclusion on cost, yes.
Why is it so much harder or more expensive to store hydrogen geologically compared to methane?
The study doesn't go into deep geological detail, but generally hydrogen is a much smaller molecule than methane. It's more reactive, and it can embrittle materials. So finding suitable geological formations, ensuring they're properly sealed to prevent leakage over years, potentially needing higher pressures or different equipment. It all adds complexity and cost.
Right. More technical challenges.
And the study does briefly mention geology, noting the UK generally has better potential for large-scale gas storage sites compared to Ireland. That could also play into the feasibility and cost in each specific country.
That's interesting. It makes you think about the whole hydrogen economy discussion, doesn't it?
Hmm.
If the focus is purely on hydrogen, are we potentially overlooking solutions like e-methane that might be more practical or cheaper, especially when this kind of long-term massive storage is needed?
That's a really important point this research raises, perhaps implicitly. Hydrogen definitely has its place, especially for decarbonizing certain tricky sectors.
Right.
But the significant hurdles and costs around storing and transporting it at scale can't be ignored. And for this specific job, interannual balancing of wind, this study suggests e-methane might just be the more economically sensible route, at least for the UK and Ireland.
And even that e-methane route adds significant cost, as we saw that 7% increase. Does the study suggest other ways to handle low wind years, perhaps to reduce the sheer amount of storage needed?
Yes, the authors are clear that IAS is likely only part of the picture. They recommend future research should definitely explore other balancing tools.
Like what?
Things like more international trade in e-fuels. Maybe import hydrogen or methane from regions with different weather patterns, or more solar potential during your low wind period.
Okay, leveraging global resources.
Also, strengthening the electricity grid interconnections with neighboring countries. If you can share power more easily across borders, that helps smooth out regional variations.
Makes sense.
And developing what they call interannual demand response, finding ways to actually shift or reduce energy demand over longer periods to match the lower supply during those lean years.
Flexible demand over years, not just hours. That's a complex one.
It is, but potentially very valuable if it can be done effectively.
So it sounds like this study is a really valuable first step in quantifying a major challenge, but it's not the final word. Like all research, I assume it has limitations. What did the authors flag?
They did. They pointed out several things. First, it's focused just on the UK and Ireland, so the results might not apply directly elsewhere. Different climates, different energy systems.
Right.
Second, they only model the interannual variability for wind, not explicitly for solar or hydro, which could have some effect.
Okay.
Third, projecting technology costs decades into the future always has uncertainties. How cheap will electrolyzers or DEAC actually get?
Sure.
Also, they used a 33-year weather data set. A longer period might reveal even more extreme low wind events we need to plan for. And finally, the model didn't fully dig into the detailed costs and logistics of the gas transport and distribution infrastructure, or the energy needed for things like gas compression during storage. So there are still refinements needed.
Okay, so crucial first estimates, valuable insights, but more work to be done to paint the full picture and explore all the options.
Exactly. This research, again titled Exploring the Demand for Interannual Storage for Balancing Wind Energy Variability in 100% Renewable Energy Systems, is a really significant contribution. It pushes the conversation beyond just seasonal storage.
Yeah.
It tackles the big, thorny issue of year-to-year wind fluctuations. And its findings strongly suggest that for the UK and Ireland, e-methane could be a more economically viable path than e-hydrogen for ensuring energy security across those multi-year timescales, mainly because of those high hydrogen storage costs.
It's a fascinating piece of the puzzle, isn't it? Achieving 100% renewables isn't just about building enough wind turbines or solar panels. It's just as much about ensuring that clean energy is there when you need it, consistently, reliably, across all timescales, daily, weekly, seasonally, and now, as the study shows, interannually.
Indeed. And this study gives us that critical first estimate of what those interannual balancing requirements might look like and what they might cost, expanding our view way beyond just thinking about winter versus summer.
And it really leaves you pondering a big question for the future, doesn't it? As we move towards these fully renewable systems, what's the right balance? How much should nations focus on achieving energy independence through massive, potentially costly domestic storage like this?
Yeah.
Versus how much should we rely on increased international cooperation, more grid connections, trading e-fuels across borders to build resilience and maybe lower costs? It forces you to think about the long-term strategy, the technology evolution, and the kind of energy future we're building. The study we've been digging into is exploring the demand for interannual storage for balancing wind energy variability in 100% renewable energy systems.